Echo Parenting and Education are putting on a 2-day conference, and it was our deep desire to invite Dr. van der Kolk to be our keynote speaker. And you know what? I feel like an Oscar speech acceptance person, but dreams can happen. And the evidence is that he's sitting right here, and he's been with us all day. When we're talking about trauma, we're saying that the only thing that can heal is a safe, stable, nurturing relationship. And I was going along for a while, not really putting these pieces together, but knowing that they fit. And I heard Bessel speak, and he said, developmental trauma is where trauma meets attachment. And I'm like, aha! Yes, that's where it fits. Of course, that's obvious. So we are hosting this conference. We usually work with parents. We do parenting classes. And we're working in a school, which has been partially funded by the California Endowment. It's a very exciting project. If you're here at the conference, I encourage you to come to our workshop tomorrow. We're working with a whole school community. So that's the whole adult staff, plant manager, office staff, teachers, parents, and the kids. I'm looking for 1,000 joys. Are you here somewhere? Yes, who are helping us with the kids. And we also do training of professionals, which is how this whole conference idea emerged. So with that particular project, we're moving more into the arena I think that the California Endowment is interested in, because there's a lot of us that work with families one-on-one. And I think a lot of us have come up against the policies that are in place in the institution that these families belong to. We met it going into domestic violence shelters, where we would be teaching a kind of connecting parenting, and then the case managers would be having an entirely different experience with a different philosophy, different kind of rules and practices in place. And so I believe that the reason they sent me up here at the endowment was to talk about the fact that not only is it important to change individuals, but that we have to start looking at how trauma affects our communities and how we can start creating systems change within those communities with projects such as the Trauma-Informed School. So now I'm going to do my job, which is to introduce Dr. van der Kolk. You are the founder of the Trauma Center.
Yes.
Correct. Okay, I'm doing well so far. And the medical director of said Trauma Center.
Yes.
Correct. You may have noticed he's also the author of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. You know what? I thought it was very kind of him to actually publish the book using the colors of Echo Parenting and Education. There was a synergy in the making. But back to Bessel. This is the things I'm going to tell you about Bessel and his work. What hit me when I heard him speak a while ago and had this dream of bringing him here to Los Angeles was that he was very, very clear on one thing, that the textbooks will only get you so far. And in fact, being the provocative gentleman that he is, he told a room full of 400 therapists, you know, your license is only a license to malpractice. And I've learned everything I know from my patients. And amazingly, the therapists all applauded him. But I have a very dear friend who said to me, reading this book, it made everything make sense. And if you have walked the terrible walk of trauma, and you read this book, everything fits into place, and it makes sense. And I don't think I could possibly give you a better introduction than that. How did I do?
No, you couldn't.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Louise. I know Los Angeles is a low-resource place, and you probably had nothing better to do than to come here tonight because there were not enough plays, movies, dance halls, etc. to come to. I don't know what you're doing here. And I wish in a way that you hadn't come so I could go to bed. But you showed up anyway. So we're going to spend some time together. I had a marvelous day today. And I had a marvelous day because there is new winds blowing out there. There's somewhere in my book I say, quote somebody else saying, we're all just a part of our time. And we get defined by our time. And my colleagues and I sort of invented this trauma stuff in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And then we thought that the world would become a better place. In fact, we have that over here. We thought the world would become a better place. And instead of becoming a better place, it became more and more prescriptive. We got an insane diagnostic system that ignores the reality of people's lives. We got an insane diagnostic system that ignores the fact that we are all parts of a large universe, that we are part of each other, that the way you behave affects the way that I am, and that most mental illness is a result of the environment and the individual being at odds with each other. And so in some ways, it didn't work out very well. And when we first discovered this issue of trauma, we had this wonderful, childlike, naive notion of the world that I see now again in my postdocs, who are wonderful, naive, and young, and lovely, and hardworking, and energetic, that they see that they can solve things. And so I thought by having this trauma stuff, that the world would become a better place. That notion came to an end in February 2003, when the US bombed the shit out of the city of Baghdad, because they were angry about what happened in 9/11, and killed 200,000 people who had nothing to do with the attack on the World Trade Center. For me, that was sort of the low point of my life and of my work. Because a few months before, I also had written an op-ed article in which I said, you can choose to go to war. Governments can just kill people. But I have to tell you, we know something about what it does to people. If you go to war, more people will kill themselves after coming home than will be killed on the battlefield, because it happens in every fucking war. You can go to war, but the people who come home, many of them it will be almost impossible for them to have loving, intimate relationships with their loved ones and their kids, because being at war tends to destroy that capacity in people. About half of the people who come home will become alcoholics or drug addicts, because after every other war, that's what happened. And so if you go consciously in this war and you really put it to people's minds, that's your choice. But the facts are that you will bring the war home to people's homes and families. And of course, it didn't make any difference. And that is the moment I stopped being optimistic about the nature of our species. And then around that time, either shortly or after, there was this wonderful picture on the front page of the New York Times. And I have been to Jerusalem about 5 times. And Jerusalem is an amazing place. It's gorgeous, glorious. It's a city built on hate, where everybody hates everybody in the name of their own particular God. And when the first time I went to Jerusalem, the first thought I had arriving at the bus station there was, oh my God, people have been killing each other for 10,000 years or longer in the name of what particular truth they believed in. And their particular truth gave them a license to kill other people. And then I see this amazing picture in the front page of the New York Times of people of all these different faiths and sects talking to each other, smiling, and eating food together. And I think something amazing has happened in Jerusalem that promises that peace will come. Then I read the article underneath it. Why are these people together? Because Jerusalem is going to have the first gay march, gay liberation march, and all of the clerics band together to kill the gays. I go, yeah, that's the nature of our species. We are one crazy species. And I have a teacher, Alvin Semrad, who I mentioned the book quite a bit, who was a lovely old guy. There's a number of things I remember of him. Let me first tell you the good thing. He's a very distinguished Harvard professor. And he says, the most important thing for me in my life is going to bed and putting my hand on my wife's naked bum. And then I know that life is okay. And that's the most important lesson I learned from my great teacher. And the other thing he taught is that hate makes the world go round. And that's another painful lesson. So that's all part of us. And so that's what I've been struggling with. People often ask me, what is your interest in trauma and where does it come from? You can always tell stories, and everybody has a story, and stories are just stories. But I think it has something to do with the fact that my father was an ardent opponent to the Nazis. And when I was born in 1943, my father was in a concentration camp, ready to be killed by the Germans for his beliefs. And he met a German soldier who was also a fundamentalist Christian like my father was, and they got into cahoots with each other. And one day, the whole camp was being shipped to an extermination camp, and that German soldier told my father, you have diarrhea, you need to go to the bathroom and take care of your bowels. And when my father came out of the bathroom, everybody had been shipped off to be killed, and my father came out, and the soldier said, oh, I forgot that you were there. Well, the camp is empty, why don't you go home? And my father walked home, and he found me, and he called me, that's his nickname for me, Barnabas, which in Hebrew means son of consolation. And that became an important part of my identity. And then my father was a very harsh man. And he would have a motto in the family in which he said, obedience without talking back. You have to absolutely do everything I tell you to do. And I was sort of a smart, alecky little kid. I was probably 3 years old. And I said, Dad, you sound like a Nazi when you say that. And they almost killed you. And now you behave like a Nazi yourself. And I think it was that very early curiosity about somebody who is willing to die for his beliefs, who then perpetrates the same thing on his own offspring. That made me very curious about all the contradictions in life. And I think it's all the contradictions that have kept me going and keep me fascinated, like this picture and stuff like that. And these were also the contradictions that got me into being interested in traumatic stress. So since this is sort of, I didn't quite know what we're doing here, but I think it had something to do with my book somewhere. I thought I'd just read you a few little passages from my book to give you an introduction. And this is how I got into traumatic stress. Chapter 1. The Tuesday after the 4th of July weekend 1978 was my first day as a staff psychiatrist at the Boston Veterans Administration Clinic. As I was hanging a reproduction of my favorite Bruegel painting, The Blind Leading the Blind, on the wall of my new office, I heard a commotion in the reception area down the hall. A moment later, a large, disheveled man in a large, stained three-piece suit, carrying a copy of Soldier Fortune magazine under his arm, burst through my door. He was so agitated and so clearly hungover that I wondered how I could possibly help this hulking man. I asked him to take a seat and tell me what I could do for him. His name was Tom. 10 years earlier, he had been in the Marines, doing his service in Vietnam. He'd spent the holiday weekend holed up in his downtown Boston law office, drinking and looking at old photographs rather than with his family. He knew from previous years' experience that the noise, the fireworks, the heat, and the picnic of his sister's backyard against the backdrop of dense early summer foliage, all of which reminded him of Vietnam, would drive him crazy. When he got upset, he was afraid to be around his family, because he behaved like a monster with his wife and his two young boys. The noise of his kids made him so agitated that he would storm out of the house to keep himself from hurting them. Only drinking himself into oblivion or riding his Harley-Davidson into dangerously high speeds helped him to calm down. Nighttime offered no relief. His sleep was constantly interrupted by nightmares about the ambush in the rice paddy back in Nam. in which all of the members of his platoon were killed or wounded. He also had terrifying flashbacks in which he saw Vietnamese dead children. The nightmares were so horrible that he dreaded falling asleep. He often stayed up for most of the night drinking. In the morning, his wife would find him passed out on the living room couch, and she and the boys had to tiptoe around him while she made him breakfast and take him to school. And he tells me a long story about how his father had been a soldier for Patton in the Second World War, and somebody showed a picture of Patton today as an example of treatment of traumatic stress, and I said, I don't think so. Slapping soldiers for cowardice was not really the right treatment for post-traumatic stress. But his father was in the Battle of the Bulge in Christmas of 1944, and he was the only survivor of his platoon, and he came back, and all he thought about was his friends who had died in the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. And he never was nice to his kids, because he was always comparing his kids with his dead comrades. And now his son had eagerly enlisted in the army in order to gain his father's love, and the same thing was happening to him, and he was also once again preoccupied with his dead comrades. And he had nightmares. And so what the story is about is that I knew about nightmares because I've always been a part-time scientist, and I worked in a sleep lab, and I had studied electrophysiology of nightmares. And so I heard his nightmares and gave him a drug to make his nightmares go away. He comes back a week later, and I triumphantly, as doctors do, expect him to be profusely grateful for the wonderful drugs I gave him. And I said, so how did the drugs work? How did my drugs work? And he said, I did not take your drugs because I realized that I need to have my nightmares because I need to be a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam. And that statement, which I can almost not say without becoming rather overwhelmed with feelings, was the opening of my career. Because I was so astounded that here was a person who, just like his father, got stuck on love. And we rarely think about love as being an antecedent of trauma. But this is something that we see pervasively throughout people's lives. If the people who you love as a little kid, and we're all programmed to love our parents, hurt you, this whole relationship to our parents who we love, who hurt us, becomes extremely complex and becomes very hard to move away. And so, as time went on and we learned more and more about biology, people started to talk more and more about trauma as a fear reaction. And indeed, the fear centers of the brain do get changed and do get activated. But what we tend to leave out is that as human beings, we are a connected species, that we all are interacting with each other, and that love is actually the glue that keeps our lives together, and a life without love has no meaning. And that love is also a very important part of traumatic stress, and gets very messed up in traumatic stress. So you get to love people who do terrible things to you, and you get to hate people who are very nice to you, and you can get sexually excited about things that hurt you, and you get numbed out to things that are pleasurable, and all of these things get very messed up. And many of these dimensions have been left out of our oversimplistic, stupid diagnostic system that we basically built up to firm up our relationship with the drug companies. So, which is true. I know because I did the first study ever on Prozac for PTSD. I did the first study ever on Zoloft for PTSD. I was a very grateful recipient of the municipals of the drug companies. I loved doing drug research because it was early and it offered a lot of promise that drugs could make a significant difference. Drugs were not bad. Drugs can be helpful. I would be the last person to say never use pharmaceutical agents. They have their place. But what happened is that our culture changed. And we forgot about human beings, even as we started to be able to treat them maybe a little bit better with the drugs that we have. And so we lost our perspective in a way. And I think meetings like these ones are meetings that are meant to recreate our perspective. But it's a very complex issue, because the people who are eager to change their perspective tend to be people who are low people on the totem pole. Now, it's a very interesting issue about hierarchy. In my world, the people on the highest level of prestige are rat researchers. Because rats, things you can easily manipulate, they can really be scientists. So right now we have many articles by rat researchers who tell clinicians how to treat their human patients. It's an odd thing. I would really not tell rat researchers how to treat their rats better on the basis of what I know about human beings. But the hierarchical situation in our hierarchy is that if you have a nice little laboratory where you can really do things very cleanly, you are the better scientist than all of you who work with gang members, teenage pregnancy people, abused kids, because you are the low people on the totem pole. And so it's a very curious power issue. And part of what I hope to do with my book is to encourage you to take more power. And when people tell you to give your patients bullshit diagnosis, like oppositional defiant disorder or bipolar disorder, to say, no, I'm not going to do that, because that is nonsense. That's not what my patients suffer from. I want to be a real diagnostician. I want to really identify what my patients are suffering from, and not some stupid list that was made up by a bunch of people who run a laboratory but never see a human being in their lives. So these are very complex issues that get played out in very complex ways and have a lot to do with money and power, etc., etc. So good luck to you. So this is the end of this chapter. In the 3 decades since I met Tom, we have learned an enormous amount, not only about the impact and manifestations of trauma, but also about ways to help traumatized people find their way back. Since the early 1990s, brain imaging tools have started to show us what actually happens inside the brains of traumatized people. I happened to again be lucky and be at the right time in the right place, and my group did the very first neuroimaging study ever about traumatized people, and we found some very interesting findings. And what did we find on that first neuroimaging study is that when people remember their trauma, their whole frontal lobe goes offline. So their whole part of their brain that has to do with thinking, figuring things out, and telling you what's right and wrong goes offline. The speech center of the brain goes offline. There's a big hole in the speech center. It's as if people have a stroke in Broca's area. And so people who are traumatized become dumbfounded. They are struck with speechless terror. That happened to show up on the very first neuroimaging study of trauma. That's interesting, because therapists tend to be people who love yakking and love talking. I love to yak also. I'm also a yakker, and I think that telling people your internal truth is terribly important. But when you come to the very core of your trauma, you're speechless. You cannot really tell what happened, because your brain is dumbfounded. And so for me, that opened up a whole quest, which happened to be a very joyful and interesting quest, and I'll show you some examples of it, of how do you get to that pain, that hurt, that frozenness, while you bypass language. And so in the past few years, we did the first NIMH-funded study of yoga for PTSD, and it turned out that yoga had better results in a very, very impaired population than any drug treatment had ever had on any traumatized population. So that sort of opens up some very interesting questions, that you can actually learn to calm your brain and your body down more effectively than drugs by engaging in practices that are important for some people over there, far away, uneducated, stupid people who just sit on mountaintops, sitting on their butt in lotus position, breathing. And somehow these people have something to offer to us in Los Angeles and even to us in Boston about how you can regulate yourself. And it becomes very clear that probably those strange things that people developed in India and China were probably developed to help people deal with trauma, because India and China are not any more reasonable or safe countries than we live in, but they have another way than we have, besides our Western way, is to take a drug and to take a swig and to drown our sorrows in alcohol. And somehow these Chinese and these Japanese and these Chinese and these Africans have found other ways of calming your body down that does not involve chemicals, which is quite interesting. So one of the things that we get with globalization, we start learning from other people. And so now we get the interesting situation that Americans sometimes have a little bit of a high opinion about themselves. Have you ever noticed that? And so we have the answer. And certainly this whole evidence-based stuff that you now get is based on studies on patients who, all the patients that you see would be excluded from any of the studies because your patients are too crazy, drug addicted, upset, freaked out, and unstable to ever be in a scientific study. So you have evidence-based treatments that are based on a population that has nothing to do with the populations that you treat. Next time, when people tell you, we won't fund you for what you're ever doing, you say, but, sir, read those papers of the evidence-based treatment. They got a 10% improvement on people who were much healthier than the people I'm trying to treat. And so can we show you some evidence-based treatment about people who are as crazy and sick and upset and weird as the people who I treat? Can you please show me the studies that really show that work? And that's part of our challenge, is to do studies on real people, the very disrupted people. And then I get amazed when a colleague of mine, Jenny Phillips, goes into an Alabama jail. I don't know how the hell she got the courage together, but she got people in a maximum security prison, and she got a group of meditators in there and taught them Vipassana meditation. To be still and quiet and to notice your internal world for 7 days in a row, during which you don't say a word to anybody. It's very hard. You can just about only do that in a captive population. But after 7 days of shutting up and just meeting your internal demons and feeling yourself, from what I can see from all the case reports and the movies I see, these people had real outcomes. The sort of outcomes we rarely get to see in our clinical practice. So now, is Vipassana meditation the thing you should do? And should insurance companies pay for it? It's up to you to ask for them. I won't do that for you. I'm working hard enough as it is. So it's complex. So the next piece I say here. We have also begun to understand how overwhelming experiences affect our innermost sensations and our relationship to our physical reality, the core of who we are. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is mainly an imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body, most of all the body. Trauma, the story is over, the event is over, it happened a long time ago. It's really no longer relevant. But your body continues to feel as if it's happening right now. You continue to feel heartbroken, your gut continues to be avenged, you continue to be uptight, frightened, tense. And you can say that's because of something terrible that happened in the past, but it doesn't matter. Because right now, when I talk with you over a cup of coffee, I'm terrified. And that's the issue, not the fact that my dad may have bitten me as a 4-year-old. Right now, I cannot have a cup of coffee with you because I start having diarrhea when I look at somebody. That's the issue. And so the trauma lives on in your body right now. And so our challenge is, how do we help people to befriend their bodies, to love their bodies, to feel safe inside of our bodies? That's why the book is called The Body Keeps the Score. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. We have discovered that helping victims of trauma find words to describe what happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually not enough. The act of telling the story doesn't necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Our search to understand trauma has led us to think differently, not only about the structure of the mind, but also about the processes by which it heals. And let me illustrate that. It's a nice British movie. So it's an English soldier who was in Bosnia. Most people in America don't know about the war in Bosnia. You know, most people in America don't know that we have been at war since 1745, basically, during the French and American and the Indian War. We have been invading other countries incessantly. We have been killing people. We have been killing slaves. We are a murderous country. And so I happened to be in Belgrade when the bombing occurred. Bill Clinton was bombing the Serbs. The Serbs are very bad people, except for her Serbs who I stayed with, who were lovely people. I used to call people in my lab, if they misbehaved, I would say to them, "Don't behave like a Serb." Then I went to Belgrade. I met the nicest people I'd ever met, and I never have said that once since that time. So we get these prejudices. But there was a war going on, and both Europeans and Americans were involved in it. This in the middle 90s. And here's a soldier who has come back. And look at the way that this old lady moves through the store. Pavlov used to call this the instinct of purpose. She's just going for it. She knows she wants that spaghetti and that sauce and whatever. She is going for it. And look at the way that he moves. Shuffling. Not clearly directed. And when you become a body-oriented person, you see how people's bodies change by trauma. That sense of, I'm here and I'm going somewhere and I know where I'm going, sort of starts collapsing. It has to do with certain parts of the brain that start falling apart. How many people here have seen couples or parents and children fight in supermarkets or other public places? How many of you go over there and intervene? A few of you. Huh? So it's interesting. So, but what we're talking about here, and that's actually when after I finished the book, I thought, so what have I really left out, or what are the great challenges? That's one of the great challenges, is the issue of the attractors in the mind. What turns you on? Where do you go? What sounds do you respond to? What issues attract you? And the sad thing is that once you get traumatized, more trauma tends to attract you. And, you know, I knew that I was really all well when I came back to Boston from California 2 weeks ago. And the snow in Boston right now is twice as hard as the car. Every street is a corridor of snow. And I came back to Boston, we came back to Boston, and we marveled at the beauty of the mountains of the snow. And so there was enormous pleasure in seeing the amazing industriousness of people who had dug out a few of the cars, about a quarter of them. Most of them were buried under mountains of snow. And the fact that people had made little holes and the fire hydrants were opened up. And we just walked night after night through Boston, marveling at this amazing landscape. Somebody else might have walked through it, cussing all the way, hating it, and not standing it. So some people's minds love stuff, and other people's minds hate the same thing. Some people's minds said they'll figure it out when a mother and a daughter are fighting, and other people's minds have an immediate need to intervene and to do something. And so one of the sad things about being a traumatized person is that trauma stuff keeps having a lot of control over you. You keep going back there. You interpret a lot of things in terms of victimization and getting taken advantage of, rather than saying, oh, that guy has a bad day, or that guy has about 50 million things on his mind and he just happens not to have room for me today, and to pass it by. And so how do you change that mindset? We don't know at this point. So that's what it's like to be traumatized. You keep reacting in a way that is upsetting to other people, that embarrasses you, that's out of tune with your surroundings. And so all of these experiences further reinforce the sense that you're crazy, that there's something wrong with you, and your sense of alienation. So at the end, it is that sense of alienation, and that you cannot trust yourself, that really messes you up when you're traumatized. You keep doing things that puts you out of sync with other people. And so people become more and more ashamed of themselves, more and more embarrassed, and more frightened, and lonely, and cut off from the human race. So, when people talk about all the returning veterans trying to commit suicide, that's how it happens, is that they're cut off from anybody. They do things that they don't understand. They're embarrassing themselves. People are embarrassed by them, and they're cut off. And that's very different from being in war, because in the war, you have your friends, your comrades, they count on you, they love you, because men at war love each other. And so coming home is an unbelievably alienating experience. But, another cultural issue, which to me has been fascinating, coming from the world of war and veterans, is that very soon it became obvious that trauma is not only the result of people going to war, but for every soldier who gets traumatized in the war, there's 30 kids who get abused and molested at home. There's more women who have been killed by their partners since 2001 than soldiers have been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it's always interesting to me, and I don't quite understand it, but it's worthwhile to talk about it and bring it to people's attention, is how when men go to war and suffer, it becomes headline news. But when women have a domestic war and suffer, that it makes the last page of the newspaper, if at all. And that's an interesting issue. And so children is another very complex issue, because all the politicians always say, we love our children, the children are the future of America, and when money needs to be cut, the first thing that always gets cut is special programs in schools, and theater programs and music programs in schools. And please march in the streets, because these are important things that people should not be led away with. Now, I love this little movie for many reasons, but one reason why I love it is it really illustrates that the issue here is not the trauma. Anybody here works at the VA? And so the treatment that's being pushed in the VA right now is prolonged exposure. That people go and revisit the scene of that trauma back there in Fallujah in order to cleanse their mind somehow. It is based on a total misunderstanding about trauma, because people, Marines, did a great job fighting in Fallujah. They really did what they were supposed to do. This guy probably did a great job back in Bosnia. He doesn't need to go back to Bosnia to relive that over again. He needs to be taught supermarket therapy, so he can walk to a supermarket and feel peaceful and be intrigued with all the different brands of cereal you can buy. Because the brain is changed, so you cannot do that anymore. And, I don't have time to go into that, but we actually know how to do that these days. and we can actually rewire people's brainwaves so they can be present and to be focused, but you can also do it with meditative techniques and yoga like that. And so it's all about helping people to be fully alive in the present. So revisiting the past is interesting. And revisiting the past is relevant if the past is secret. If the past is something you cannot talk about. If you were not allowed to talk about the fact that your mom hit you, or that your dad molested you, or your brother would come into your room and do terrible things to you, and it's become a family secret, then talking becomes terribly important. Because learning how to tell the truth is critical. But after an event like 9/11, there's no reason to talk about it. We lived in a common reality. There were no secrets. Nobody blamed anybody here. You could talk about it, but actually nobody did, because we had seen what happened. And nobody was struggling with dark and terrible secrets. So the issue of psychotherapy is only relevant if people deal with dark secrets that they have a hard time coming to terms with. And that's about it. So I've been on the road for a long time, talking about trauma. And sometimes I meet people, oh, I heard you back in 1989. That was a great talk. My reaction is always, that's weird, because I didn't know anything about trauma in 1989. So it must be my accent. Right? And this is really the tape I'm about to show you, is the tape that made me know something about trauma. And it started when a bunch of people at my clinic started to do EMDR. How many people in this room do EMDR? A small minority. I can't blame for the other people in the room to not do EMDR, because it's a very weird and bizarre treatment. You ask people to call up their memories of what happened, what they saw, what they heard, what they were thinking, and you ask them to follow your eyes, your hands, as you move them back and forth in front of their eyes, and do that for a while, and then you stop it, you ask what comes up, it sets up a sort of dreamlike state, and people form new associations, and you just keep doing that sort of weird waving your finger in front of people's eyes. And my postdocs were telling me that after about 3 or 4 sessions, many people had resolved their trauma. And I was a young, ambitious professor at Harvard Medical School, and I said, stop that shit immediately. This is another crazy cult-like thing that people do on a regular basis, and stop it. But they happened to be some of the smartest people in my clinic, and they secretly kept doing it. And then some of my patients started to go to EMDR, and they came back. And let me give you an example of a person who was a great inspiration. I had a patient who was a PhD psychologist who ran a group home for sexually abused adolescents who also herself had a history of sexual abuse. And she was referred to me by an old supervisor who I did not really think liked me. So I was very surprised that old supervisor sent this woman to me. And it turned out this woman was a very abrasive, angry woman who had called her therapist 12 times the C word, the only forbidden word in the English language, to her therapist. And at the end of that session, the therapist said to her, I think we're not a good match. I know somebody who you probably should go to. So she came to my doorstep, and she couldn't call me a C, because it would have been inappropriate to my gender. And she came into a group with me, and was smart and funny and abrasive and in your face, and I sort of liked her. A little hard to take sometimes. And then one day she comes back to the group, and she said, I did an EMDR training, and I have to tell you what happened to me. I remembered the time that my father raped me when I was 8 years old. And she had always hated herself, this woman. She said, I love my daddy, it was my fault. And she said, when I did the EMDR, I saw myself, and I saw this little scrawny 8-year-old. And I saw this huge guy lying on top of it, smelling of alcohol, smelly, hairy, sweaty, disgusting. How can a big, disgusting guy do something like that to a little girl like her? And the moment that she really accurately saw what had happened to her back then, with her adult mind, she said, it wasn't my fault. That is a terrible person who should never have done that to that little girl. And she was great in a few sessions. And so that's one of the things that opened me up to EMDR. And this other thing is this.
Your story is as I took it down last week.
So that's Steve Lazaroff. And like many EMDR people, he became like his Jehovah's Witness. He was pounding down my door to show me his EMDR tapes. I said, get away from me. I want to see Walt Disney movies. I don't want the stupid tape. And one night, I'm too tired to resist his advances, and he shows me this tape. And the opening is something that I see all the time in my office.
Your story is as I took it down last week.
What do I see? Is that before a word is spoken, the woman starts freaking out. And so the moment you call a trauma in your mind, your body starts reliving the trauma. You know what I'm talking about? So it's even before a word has been spoken. That's the primacy of the body. We are our bodies. Our bodies are traumatized bodies, and when we have our flashbacks, our whole bodies start behaving and feeling as if we're back there again. And so I see this and go, yep. Now that's a typical reaction to trauma, and I'm really angry with Steve for ruining my Saturday evening with another person who starts telling their trauma story and gets only more upset by doing so. But I learned something from this first tape, because around this time that I get involved in EMDR, I also get to know Peter Levine and Pat Ogden, who do sensory motor psychotherapy. And I'm an old Dutch Calvinist. We don't have bodies either. I mean, we just don't have bodies. And I'd written this paper called The Body Keeps the Score, same title as this book. And they see my work and they say, oh my God, that's pathetic. You clearly don't know anything about the body. Would you like to learn something about the body? And I said, I guess so. That'd be really nice. And so I'm beginning to learn something about the body. And I'm beginning to learn something like when you look at a videotape like this means something. I was never taught that this means something. And so I'd like to invite you to sit right now just like this woman sits. So just assume her position. Her shoulders are up, her butt is slightly lifted from the chair, and go like this, and I'll say, it's a wonderful evening in Los Angeles. Okay? And so I'm beginning to learn something. It's a long story, and it actually, I didn't write it in the book. Some good stuff got left on the cutting room floor. And that is that some very important research has been done, that the way that you hold your body determines how you feel. I mean, you sit like this, you will be an uptight person. Everything you do will be uptight, your thoughts will be uptight, you'll hate yourself, because that you cannot feel joyful. And what the same person, her name was Nina Bull, also discovered, is that when you hold your hands like this, you may want to do that, because that's the gesture of joy. Now try to feel like shit. And you can. So very simply, that the way that you hold your body, to a large degree, will determine what will happen in your mind. Unknown piece of research done in 1951 and 1952. There's people back then, of course, didn't know anything. But I wish that people would still know that. Because you could help a lot of people to get a lot better if you help them to actually assume body positions that had to do with power, enjoyment, etc., etc. So, I'm mad at Steve and say, okay, enough. He says, let me show you a videotape of what happened at the beginning of my third session. He's had 2 sessions of EMDR. And by now, I'm a good enough body person. I think that's remarkable. That's a different person. And again, I would like to invite you to assume the body posture of this woman. And I'd like you to put your hands like this, your shoulders back, and show me your sternocleidomastoid muscle, this muscle over here, which I've been looking for all day, because Darwin taught us back in 1872, I like these old dead white guys, that this muscle is your muscle of curiosity. And when you're curious about something, you stretch this muscle. In traumatized people, this muscle is never activated because traumatized people are profoundly non-curious because the whole world is a threatening place and you always sit like this. And so, seeing a person sit like this, again, assume this position, and then, I bet like many of you, like I, like art. When I go to Europe, I go to the Louvre or the British Museum or the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam or the Los Angeles Museum. And in white European art, you never see somebody sit like this. You always see people with lances and plumes and stuff sticking out. That's sort of Western way of dealing with the world. And indeed, we did conquer the world as Western folks with our lances and our plumes. But then you go to other parts of the world like Thailand and Japan, and Taiwan and Bali, and people sit like this. And now sit like her. Put your shoulders back. Breathe in the top of your lungs. Take out your neck. And now think about how much you hate Dick Cheney. And you can't. This position is incompatible with hatred. And maybe there's a reason why people in Southeast Asia cultivate sitting like this. Because when you sit like that a lot, life becomes a much gentler business. But Steve, in doing EMDR with her, had not told her to sit like this. But he had done something to her damn brain that made her automatically assume that position. So these weird eye movements had caused this whole organism to get configured in a different way.
Can you describe what happened that day for me?
Yeah, I was going up to a traffic light, turned yellow, and I was still...
She's telling the story now as if she's reading from a teleprompter. And, I'm a scientist, so we do research. And we show what happens in the brain. And what comes online with these silly eye movements is an area of the brain called the anterior cingulate. The anterior cingulate is sort of a non-conscious, but close to conscious part of the brain that helps you to distinguish the relevance of information. That helps you sort of put together thinking and emotion and to screen out what's not important and to screen in what's important. So somehow, mysteriously, these eye movements have caused a change in a part of the brain that helps you to focus on what's relevant and to ignore what's irrelevant. I don't know how else you can do that. I don't think you can do it by wagging your fingers in people, by punishing people for certain behaviors. And so this is the real challenge of our work, is to apply the neuroscience that we know today to see what happens in the brain that gets messed up by trauma, and how can you activate those little pieces that got deactivated by trauma. If we had more time, I could show you a lot of videos, a lot of brain scans that really should be our core of true science, not bullshit diagnostic systems, but really said, what is really going in the brain here? How do people process information? How can we change the processing of information?
Stopped behind the white line. my left isn't moving, wondered why.
And so that's how I've lived my life. When I see something where I go like, wow, this is different from anything else. First time happened with Prozac, the second time happened with the EMDR, the third time happened with yoga, the fourth time happened with neurofeedback, where I saw results that were absolutely different from anything that anything else could achieve. I said, okay, I'm going to spend the next 10 years of my life figuring this piece out. And so I went to NIMH. And because I had done the first Prozac studies, I said to Mr. NIMH, I would like to compare the most common drug for PTSD, Prozac, with this crazy eye movement stuff. And they gave me a substantial amount of taxpayer money to do the study. And we enrolled 100 people in the study. And after 8 weeks, so there's 100 people, a third of them got pill placebo. And getting a pill with nothing in it caused a 44% improvement. That's the beauty about doing science. So 44% improvement is better than any of the evidence-based treatments that you are told to do with your patients. And so I have an evidence-based treatment, which I will soon go to China to have them manufacture pills with nothing in it. Dr. Van der Kolk's anti-PTSD pills and an evidence-based treatment. And it will prove that I have an effective pill. Placebo is very interesting. That being known, being seen, being paid attention to, being in a very serious study, having people make you feel important and valued is a tremendous boost for people's well-being. So you, as clinicians, should be at least getting a 44% improvement in 8 weeks of treatment. And if you don't, you may want to question what you're doing because you're being beaten by an inert pill. Again, this is not the toughest population, so I'll cut you some slack on that. Prozac, this is 8 weeks, Prozac did slightly better. Some of you may have learned statistics. There's an issue in statistics called power. That the power of a study has to do with the number of people involved in the study, determines how statistically significant you can make something. If you have a small people with 100 people, a difference of 2% doesn't have the statistical power to be significant. If you have a lot of money, like in all the studies I did for the drug companies, and we enrolled 300 or 400 people, you have a lot of power. And you can make a small difference statistically significant. So science, to a large degree, belongs to the people who can have the most money, because small differences become more and more important the larger your sample size. So if you do art therapy, it's unlikely you can muster $1 million for a study, and it's going to be very hard to show how statistically significant you are. We will talk about it when you do a study, and I can be a consultant. Prozac did much better. And so after 8 weeks, we told people to go home, and we said, we'll see you in 2 months, do whatever you want to do. And 2 months later, the Prozac people were a little bit worse. The EMDR people were a little bit better. They said, good luck, see you in 6 months. 6 months later, the Prozac people were beginning to really relapse, and the EMDR people will continue to do better. But doing better is not good enough. After seeing this EMDR tape, or after seeing the neurofeedback that I showed some of you this afternoon, you don't want people to be just feeling a little bit better. You want people to be cured. You want people to say, it's over. And so we have a measure, which all of us use in this field, of when people are cured. And it turned out after 8 weeks of EMDR, 1 out of 5 people said, I'm cured. 1 out of 7 Prozac people. But 2 months later, 28% of the EMDR people say, I'm cured. And none of the Prozac people. So Milton Erickson used to say, once you kick the log, it keeps flowing. Once you open up that road to liberation, your own mind might be able to do the work. 6 months later, 60% of our EMDR people are completely cured without any further intervention, and none of the Prozac people. This, at this point, still to this day, but maybe not for long, is the most successful outcome study in PTSD ever. And so we do this study, and I'm cheering and jumping up and down, and I say to my colleagues, we'll make the front page of the New York Times science section, because this is a major thing with major economic implications, because it shows that 8 weeks of a trauma-focused treatment is more effective than drugs. And in the long range, it's much cheaper to treat people for 8 weeks than to keep them on medications forever. So I'm all cheerful and optimistic, because I'm still youngish at that point, but not for long, because Joseph Spinazzola, who now is the executive director of my clinic, then still a young student, says, but Bessel, we wiggled our fingers in front of people's eyes. The New York Times is not going to take that seriously. And indeed, before we did EMDR, and I told my real scientist colleagues, I say that EMDR is a kick-ass treatment. And he would say, so, nobody's done the science. We don't know how it works, we don't know whether it works. And I said, okay, I'll do the science. So I did the science, and now I told my colleagues, EMDR is a kick-ass treatment. And my colleague said, I don't believe it. I said, so before we did the study, it was a scientific question. Now that we have done the science, it becomes a religious question. So you want to play it any way you want to. But this actually is true all the time. People tend to be more led by their opinions than by facts. People are very devoted to their beliefs against overwhelming evidence, as, for example, exemplified by the invasion of Iraq. And that was the second piece. The second piece is very important, and I didn't have all that much chance to talk about it today. But there's a very core issue. That we created this diagnosis of PTSD back in 1980 for Vietnam veterans. And now we have a diagnosis in the official textbooks that's a trauma diagnosis. And shortly after the diagnosis made it into the DSM-3, it became very obvious that there's a whole other group of traumatized people, namely the traumatized people that most of you treat, or are, or both, namely the people who were hurt at home, growing up, betrayed at home, abandoned, put in foster home. And those are also traumatized people. But it's a very different population, because it has to do with the attachment system, it has to do with immature brains. As I talked about earlier today, and I have much more about it in the book, is that your brain matures in the context of the attachment relationship. And if you get hurt by your caregivers, all kind of stuff starts happening in your brain. And I fought for years to get another diagnosis in DSM called developmental trauma disorder that captures the reality of people who are victims of chronic childhood trauma that is very different from soldiers or car accident victims. And so we were interested in our study how adults who had been raped or victims of assault or torture or whatever, how they responded vis-a-vis people who had long-standing histories of childhood trauma. And as luck would have it, exactly half of our sample were adults who had pretty reasonable childhoods, who had an adult trauma, and about half of them were adults who, as children, had ongoing interpersonal traumas. We did EMDR, and it turned out that EMDR was sensationally effective for one-time trauma. Now when people come into my office, I'll give you an example. If they come into my office with the one-time trauma, I say with great confidence, against the evidence I see in front of my face, because these people are in horrendous shape, I say, you'll probably be okay within a few weeks. Because that's what our research shows. And so I have an example. Last year, a guy comes to see me on crutches. He's a junior professor in one of these many universities we have in Boston, and he's also a champion squash player, nationally ranked squash player. And he's been riding his bicycle in the suburb of Boston, and at one point a car came from a side street, came into the road that he was on, drove over him, and kept driving. And he was underneath that car, being dragged along by that car until some other driver said, excuse me, there's a guy being dragged underneath the car. And as this happened, half of his leg is being shorn off. And this is an athlete. This is his main identity. So the guy is he's in shambles. He walks in on crutches. He is almost just terrible shape. And empathically, I think I'll never get this guy better because it's so horrible. But I remember my research. And I say, let's just try some EMDR. And we do a little bit of EMDR, and he starts laughing or smiling. He says, what do you get now? He says, I'm really strong. I held onto the chassis of that car as that car was dragging me along, and that saved my life. Boy, I am really strong. Say, stay with that. When you do EMDR, no interpretations, no comments. You help a person to do the work. And next thing comes up, that leg. That leg was dragged along and held me up. And if that leg had given out, I would have been dragged on my pelvis. And if my pelvis had been dragged along, I would be dead. So I really feel great for that leg that I no longer can use to help me. I hadn't said anything. And what this to me illustrates, in general, is that traumatized people are astoundingly creative. Most of us are pretty astoundingly creative. But what we need to do is to liberate the natural creativity in traumatized people. And that's what we should focus on, is to open up the people's natural healing capacities. And we don't need to do anything. We don't need to tell people what to do. We don't need to tell people what to feel. We need to think. But our job is much more complicated. It's to just liberate people's internal capacities. That's tough. So this is childhood trauma. And in my book I have several cases of people who with childhood trauma who also got much better. But EMDR is not the best treatment for chronic betrayal and stuff. It is helpful. It's a helpful tool. All these things are tools. Yoga is a tool. Neurofeedback is a tool. EMDR is a tool. They're not the answer. What I said earlier today, if anybody says that they have found the answer, immediately throw them out of your office. Because that means that they're religious fanatics and not people who are really interested in the truth. And so, yes, it's helpful, but you need more than just that. And so life went along well until I met a guy by the name of Michael Mithoever. And Michael had, after a prolonged struggle, gotten a permission from the FDA to give people MNDA, ecstasy. And he was now taking a whole group of traumatized people, policemen, firemen, traumatized guys mainly, and he was giving them ecstasy. And while he was doing ecstasy, he was doing a treatment with them called IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy. That's the topic of chapter 17 of my book. It's a very wonderful therapy. It's very, very helpful. And his outcome data are spectacular. They're about the same as our outcome data with the EMDR. And so now there's this new treatment. And the New York Times writes it up, and a lot of people talk about it and say, ecstasy is the treatment of choice for PTSD. No. Nothing is the treatment of choice for PTSD. What does ecstasy do? I've never taken it, but I know enough about it to know what it does. It makes people feel still, calm, and peaceful. And anything that makes people feel still, calm, and peaceful allows them to revisit the past calmly. And if you can revisit the past calmly, as you also do in EMDR, and also in hypnosis, and possibly any other number of things that you know about and I don't, if you help people to feel completely safe, they can visit themselves in that traumatic situation. And if you can visit yourself calmly, your brain can bring all the stuff online that got knocked off at the time of the trauma. You can reprocess the trauma and integrate it. So the challenge is, how can you make a person feel completely safe so they can visit themselves and say, yes, this happened to me, and it's awful, but today is March 2015, and I'm okay. So that's the challenge. Very hard. You know, we did a study we've done a whole series of yoga studies. And in one of our first yoga studies, we had people hooked up to a physiology monitor. And because we wanted to show that yoga changes certain physiological parameters in the body. And indeed, in non-traumatized people, during Shavasana, the end stage of yoga, where you lie united with the universe, totally calm and peaceful, that people had very nice, beautiful, stable physiologies. And then one day, my research assistant walks into my office because she's been analyzing the physiology data during Shavasana, and she says, "Oh, Bessel, we totally messed up the study. I get nothing but muscle artifacts, and we can not read these people's physiology." And I say, that's data. And that's the beauty of doing science. You learn stuff from your failures. Because during Shavasana, you're supposed to be totally calm and totally safe. And what we found is that during this stage, traumatized women continue to move their muscles as if they were being attacked. And that to me brought home this very complex issue, is how do you make a severely traumatized person feel completely and utterly safe? And that is really the great challenge. So, I have this conference every year. This year is the 26th year. The brochure is out there. If you ever want to go to Boston after the snow is melted, it's a glorious place. At the end of May, we have a conference. This time is for the 26th year. And I invite every year leading neuroscientists, leading attachment researchers, and people who do kick-ass trauma interventions. And we get together for 3 days and do all that stuff. And this year we have another amazing year. It's a great job to have, is to just invite a bunch of really amazing people and say, would you like to come to my conference? They always say yes. And I get to hang out with wonderful people for a few days. So one year, we have Joe Ledoux come to visit us, the neuroscientist. And he shows us this slide. And that comes from his work. He published this in 2001, right after the attack on the World Trade Center. And so he says, if this is the brain, and the brain is faced with threat, the first thing that threat hits inside of the brain is the LA, the lateral nucleus of the amygdala, meaning the smoke detector in your brain that tells whether something is dangerous or safe. Happens all the time. Here's some vague air conditioning. My amygdala hears it. It says, that's okay, don't worry about it. You hear another sound. It says, that's okay, don't worry about it. But certain things that my amygdala interprets as being safe, you may not interpret it as safe. If you were assaulted while during the hum of an air conditioning, the sound of an air conditioning now become a traumatic trigger for you, and your little smoke detector of your brain may say, this is dangerous. And so the big thing with traumatized people is that certain sounds, certain images, certain body sensations become harbingers of danger, and they start behaving as if it's acting. So this is what Ledoux found in his laboratory, that if the threat hits the amygdala, the smoke detector, and then is channeled towards the basal ganglia, the movement part of the brain, that's the part of the brain that makes your muscles move, and you do something, then you set up a cycle of competence. An example of this is what the U.S. Marine Corps does in training young Marines. People come there, they're a bunch of good-for-nothing, horny, pimply little kids, and they come to Camp Lejeune, and they're woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, march. And they march and they crawl through the mud, and machine gun fire strafes over the head. And at 10 o'clock at night, they go to bed and they say, oh my God, this is the toughest day of my life, but I did it, I survived. A few hours later, woken up again, put through all that stuff, day after day, week after week, and after 12 weeks, these guys are amazing. I was a CO during the Vietnam War. I got to love the U.S. Marine Corps because they are doing an amazing job turning guys into very powerful, focused people. Very impressive. And they do that by challenging people to the max. So there's nothing wrong with being challenged to the max. What is wrong, according to Ledoux, and certainly along my model also that I also formulated independently of him, it's about inescapable shock. If you cannot do something, and almost all trauma has to do with not being able to get away. If you're a kid who's being abused, you cannot walk away. If you're in a car accident and you're pinned down, you cannot do something about it. As long as you can do something, you're going to be okay. But it's the challenge of action that messes people up. So what it do shows is that if action is being cut off, it takes a different pathways, hits the central nucleus of the amygdala, and then you set up a circuit of panic and fear. And you have the same secretion of stress hormones, but instead of mobilizing your stress hormones, as happened in Boston in the last 2 months, to help you to dig out your car, and boy, did you see some great use of stress hormones in my part of the world in the last 2 months. Instead of using your stress hormones to do something, you use your stress hormones to become panicked and fearful. And so then Joe says, so the answer to trauma is to go play tennis and to take people for a walk. I say, one step too far, Joe. You're a rat researcher. And you don't know about human trauma. Because I have one of my patients is national Taekwondo champion. She has the most horrendous trauma history and makes repeated suicide attempts, used to cut herself, just terrible, terrible. But when she is in that Taekwondo mode, she kicks ass. But I was never, for a long time, was unable to combine these two entities that lived inside of the same body to get that sort of power. And so the question is, no, going for a walk, playing tennis, learning martial arts isn't good enough. It has to do with having people have experience that previously led to misery and collapse, and now expose them to something very close to it and being able to survive well. The one group of people who I know who really understood that principle are not my colleagues, not social workers, but a bunch of karate teachers in Oakland, California, who 30 years started a program called Model Mugging, now called Impact. What had happened is there was a yoga instructor, 5th degree black belt, karate instructor, who was raped in Oakland. And her friends got together and said, how is it possible that somebody who could basically kill anybody with her bare hands, how can she get killed or raped? And they thought about it, and they said, she must have become de-skilled. And we all know about getting de-skilled. That given the right circumstance, the right boss, the right stare, the right situation, and you become suddenly a blubbering idiot. And afterwards you say, how can I be so stupid? How could I lose it? I had all the right answers, but I just got overwhelmed. And so when people become anxious, they lose their skills. And so they thought a lot about it. And they started this program, and they said, you know, a lot of women in general, and it's now a program for all women, but particularly traumatized women, tend to get very scared when meeting some scary guy or some scary situation. And so what we need to do is to teach these traumatized women mindfulness and to not lose it. And when somebody threatens them, to stay in a frame of mind where they say, that guy's an asshole. And he's trying to hurt me. So let me just observe how he's going to hurt me and stay focused on what I can do to defend myself. Mindfulness is always at the core of just about any program that I know that works for trauma. And then they said, we're going to teach these women how to do karate and to poke people's eyes out and kick their knees out from underneath them and kick them in the groin and stuff like that. So I have this patient, I still see her sometimes, who was one of these people who like many people we all know, had a horrendous trauma history. But she happened to love books. And she would escape into her books. And her books were a safety. And so she learned how to take exams. And she learned how to be very competent in books. And she made it into Harvard. And her father used to sell her as a little girl at truck stops in the Midwest. And she was trafficked by her father. And so she's a brilliant student. And she's suicidal, terrible eating disorders, not a friend in the world, cuts herself, terrible shape. And I give a talk at the Harvard Health Service, and I talk about EMDR, and they sent her to me for EMDR. And she's a case in the book. And she happens to be the greatest EMDR virtuoso I've ever seen, and she gets better in 8 sessions of EMDR. And somebody with her history should not get better with 8 sessions of EMDR. That's just way off the scale of success. And so she said, I'm better, and they say, okay, if you say so, good luck, goodbye, you have my number, if anything's up, call me up. And so she calls me up 2 months later and says, you know, Bessel, I've never had a friend over. I've never cooked dinner for anybody. I've never had a consensual sexual relationship. I don't know nothing. And so how can you help me to get a sort of cobble a life together? And I say, well, Judy Herman runs groups for people with histories like you, so you should go in a group with her, meet other people with your histories, get some intimacy going with other women, and maybe you should go to the model mugging program and learn what you feel like in your body. And so this is her graduation tape from her model mugging program. I always identify with the guy lying on the floor, so a bit of a traumatic tape for me. When you're traumatized, you feel powerless, you feel defenseless. Doing things that give you power, particularly things that are very close to what robbed you of your power in the first place, is an astounding way in which you can rewire the brain. I'm all into rewiring the brain. So if you put it in pure brain terms, before she got this program, her amygdala, that little smoke detector, sees a big scary guy, hears a scary answer, and starts flooding her brain with stress hormones. She collapses, freezes, becomes useless. Now she has a new experience. She sees a big scary guy, hears him, and she has this delicious feeling of kicking somebody in the groin and having him squirm on the ground. That's resetting the limbic system. Trauma therapy is all about resetting the limbic system. The proof of the pudding comes 2 months later. She calls me up and says, hey, I'm in your neighborhood, can I come over to tell you a story? I don't want to pay for it because it's not treatment. And I said, stop on by. And she says, 2 nights ago, I was studying at the Widener Library at Harvard, and it was midnight, and the lights went on and off, singing us to go home. So I put my books under my arm. I started walking down Oxford Street in Cambridge, and about 3 blocks down, near Wendell Street, 3 guys jump from behind bushes and say, bitch, give me your money. You know what I did? I went like, okay, guys, I've been trained for this. Which one of you would like to take me on first? And they ran away. And so I never got to really prove my skills. That is trauma therapy. I have to show you one more little thing, because it's important. Another thing from Joe Ledoux. If that fear center is in your animal survival brain, over here, what Ledoux shows is that your thinking, analyzing, figuring things out part of the brain has no pathways to that fear center of your brain. You cannot talk yourself out of hating Dick Cheney. You cannot talk yourself out of, you shouldn't feel this way. You shouldn't love that guy. Ever tried to talk yourself out of being in love with somebody? All your friends say, don't be in love with this guy. And you say, I know. But it doesn't work. Because your rational brain has no access to your emotional brain. It absolutely baffles me that the most important treatment that's being taught to all social workers and psychologists, particularly in America, is CBT, to become a rational person. Have you ever been in an intimate relationship? Have you ever tried to talk your honey into being reasonable? Have you ever had a teenage kid and shown your teenage kid the error of their ways, and they have said, oh, thank you, Dad, that's so helpful. I will never do this again. How crazy can you be? And that's the predominant theory of treatment. And people paying millions and millions of dollars a year on a treatment that doesn't make any sense from any brain or trauma perspective. But it's not over. So because Joe shows that there is a part of your brain that does have access to your emotional brain, to the fear center. And the way that your brain is built up is, and all of us who have kids know about it, is that the side part of your brain is all social. It's all about going to the zoo and exploring things and pointing things out and reading books and making puzzles and all that stuff you can share with other people. We are pervasively social creatures. And most of our brain is about that. But in the middle of our brain, we have a little mohawk. It's the mohawk of self-awareness. It starts with the orbital prefrontal cortex, which I talked about earlier today, then the medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the posterior cingulate. So it goes all the way. It's called the midline structures of the brain. Those are the structures having to do with self-perception. Those are the only structures of your brain that can access your animal brain. So sooner or later, all of us start hanging out with people like that, because it's all about meditation, interoception, getting to know yourself. It's all about mindfulness. There is no mind without mindfulness. There is no capacity to own yourself without mindfulness and without knowing yourself. And that's very hard. But because when traumatized people start sitting still and start paying attention to themselves, they meet the demons. And being still and doing meditation is excruciatingly difficult for traumatized people. So all of you guys say, oh, meditation is great for these kids. Mindfulness exercise is great for these kids. It's not so simple. Because these kids can't stand what they discover when they sit inside of themselves. That's why that Vipassana meditation was successful, because it was done in a jail. If they'd done it anywhere else, all these guys would have run as far as they could, because the trauma is not out there. The trauma is living inside. And so the great challenge of our work for ourselves, the people we work with, is how do you go inside of yourself and change your brain and change yourself by becoming friends with your internal experience. I've been given the time sign. If I didn't have the time sign, I'd like to explain what this slide shows. Is it okay? Okay. So my former student, Ruth Lanius, who's Canadian, and she finds 16 normal Canadians to put in the scanner. Almost all Canadians are normal. It's very easy to come by. And they say, just lie in the scanner and do anything. It's called, you activate what's called the default state of the brain. And when you just lie there thinking about yourself, you activate all the midline structures that have to do with you. You think about, I'm lying here. Oh, I wish I'd gone to the bathroom. Oh, that's for it feels hard. It's your parietal cortex. It says, oh, this board I'm lying on is a little hard. And this part of your brain is the orbital prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate. It's all about this is who I am. I'm a pretty good guide, volunteering to be part of this experiment for these stupid people at the university, and they're not even paying me for it. Good for me. So these are the midline structures of self-awareness. Then they put 18 chronically traumatized people, like the people we all treat, in the scanner, and say, just lie there and notice what goes on with you. There's certain neuroimaging studies that should knock your sock off and say, okay, this really changes the whole ball game. What you see here is that all the structures in the brain having to do with self-awareness, self-knowledge, and self-experience are knocked out. There is no there there. They're not home. Stuff happens to people, but they're not the agents of their fate. They just respond. So, neuroimaging and neuroscience is important because you can come up with a lot of superficial solutions, but if there's nobody home, the solutions ain't going to work. And so the challenge is, how do you get people to notice themselves, to feel themselves, to feel their bodies, to feel what goes on inside of themselves. And only after you know your interiority can you begin to have a life. I showed you some other scans today. And so these are the themes of my book, is don't really come up with really superficial solutions, because these are very complex problems. They have solutions, but they only have solutions if you really treat the real problem. Not bipolar disorder, oppositional defiant disorder and stuff, but the fact that you cannot feel yourself. You cannot notice yourself. That you're not aware when you have to go to the bathroom, because that part of your brain is not there anymore. When something happens and you suddenly blow up and you don't know why, because the signals in your body were absent when you were doing them. So, that's all I have to say for today. Now I'm going to go to sleep.
Thank you. We have some time for Q&A.
Thank you very much for being here. I had a couple questions, but I work at the VA hospital with veterans that come back from the war and have chronic mental illness. And you're talking about the importance of people accessing their creativity for
Imagination,
yeah, for curing themselves. And what I find a lot with the veterans is that they've lost that will of creativity and imagination. Do you have any thoughts about how to access that again, and what criteria might exist for somebody to be able to have that capacity to self-heal?
If you come to the trauma conference on May 28th of this year, you'll see a group of actors who do Shakespeare with burned out chronic alcoholic veterans. It is stunning. For these guys to have to act a role that they're totally unaccustomed to be able to mouth a line, to be able to think about the meaning of their line and to stand up there and to read it, is spectacularly successful. The sad thing is that going to medical school or graduate school in psychology ill prepares you to open up the imagination in the people you work with. And you may have to turn to people who know more than we do about opening up imagination, like kindergarten teachers. So I hang out with actors, hang out with martial artists and people like that, and they teach me how to do that. My medical school curriculum did not include that.
First of all, I want to commend you for being a real seeker of truth. I think so many scientists out there have surprisingly closed mind because they believe their beliefs rather than observe for themselves and know for themselves. So I'm so grateful for your open-mindedness.
Thank you.
And my question is, you talked about yoga. It sounds like it was the physical yoga. And there's yoga beyond that, which is more about mind, about consciousness. And it sounds like what's important here is building consciousness or and self-awareness. And so I guess my question is there any thought about doing future research into that yoga that is about dropping belief, about dropping ideas, because all ideas and all beliefs actually block us from truly perceiving and knowing who we are, from truly perceiving reality?
You know, what research gets done is purely a question of two things. One is the interest of the investigator, who needs to be a good researcher, and the other one is the availability of money. I know of one person, Richie Davison, sort of a right-hand person of the Dalai Lama, who has enough of a track record that he might get the sort of money to answer questions like that. I don't know anybody who at this point in their career would be able to garner the sort of resources to answer that question. That may evolve over time. I've seen amazing evolution in terms of the questions that people beginning to ask. For example, we just submitted a grant on self-compassion meditation. Whether we'll get the money or not is another question, but these are very hard things to study. And so personally, I would not find the question that you have compelling enough for the field of mental health to devote 5 years of my life to it. But you probably would. And so it depends on your degree of passion and your capacity to raise funds to make that happen.
We have a few questions in the back. A number of people came over from the overflow room.
I just want to say the only thing more incredible than you being here is the fact that this was free. To a broke intern, that really means a lot. So
Thank you.
I want to thank the powers that be that made that a reality. And I'm hoping you'll sign my book. I also work with veterans, and I'm wondering what thoughts you have about assisting people whose moment of trauma was not necessarily defined by powerlessness, but by a feeling of being totally powerful and totally in control, and actually in turn being the perpetrators of traumatic events and not necessarily the victims. And I'm also wondering, sort of in line with that, if you've heard of the research on moral injury.
Actually, I did that research so long ago that nobody quotes it. Actually, I probably was the first researcher on moral injury. I didn't call it moral injury, but I'd call it. What we found back in the late 70s, actually, is that after you see your friends getting injured, you get filled with rage. And you try to take revenge, and it's a normal thing to do. And you do terrible things to other people. And actually the opening chapter of my book has a case like that in it, and my research on it. And it's a terrible thing, it's a terrible trauma, because you cannot go home again. Because after you rape people, you cannot really stare your honey in the face without being reminded about the people you raped. If you kill children, it's hard to play with your kid because you're reminded about the child that you killed. And so dealing with that, mourning yourself. The best book that I know about it, the book that really touched me very deeply, is a book by Carlo Malantes, What It's Like to Go to War. You know it? I think what he writes about his own journey back is astounding, actually. And if I were involved in the VA, I would say make that required reading for everybody. But it's a long journey, as you can see. A journey of penance and of forgiveness, self-forgiveness. But it's a very important issue.
I'm a yoga teacher, a parent educator, and also a mom. So my question kind of relates to my experience. I teach pre- and postnatal yoga. So I'm curious if you've thought about trauma in the womb and mother's traumatic experience as it relates to the unborn child. And the second part of the question, or second question, you could choose, whichever makes sense. You talked about adult brains and like a one-time trauma versus developmental trauma. And I just wondered if you'd looked at immature brains and sort of like a big shock trauma.
You know, we only have one life to lead, and we can only pay attention to that many things in the 70 or 80 years allotted to us for productive work. So I've decided to focus on stuff that happens after the womb. there are some data. If we had had more time, I might have showed the data from my friend Rachel Yehuda, who studied all the women who were pregnant in the World Trade Center on September 11th, and what happened to their biology and the babies and the biology of their babies, and how their genes got changed. And there's a woman in Sweden by the name of Öhman who's studying that also. So there are some people interested in doing that. But I'm like many people in this room. I'm working with traumatized kids and adults, and I have my hands full with what I'm doing without stretching it even further. So I don't have anything to say about it. It's an interesting topic. Yeah. Okay, thank you.